I'm making sweet corn for dinner, and do you know about corn? Do you know that it's a grain, a grass, and a vegetable all at once? When I was in college for biology, one of the jobs that I had during the summer was as an agricultural farmer for a place that it wasn't really a farm where it sold the plant, but it sold the data that we collected from the plants. Big companies that made herbicides and pesticides and special varieties of vegetables would hire us, our company, to plant them in rows and blocks and then, take measurements and monitor what we saw and then give that data back to them. One of the jobs I had to do, along with irrigation and keeping control of the different trials that we were doing in the different rows and the different blocks, was pollinating the sweet corn and field corn, I think. We had rows of corn that we had to keep track of with labels and maps. So corn is an evolution of a grass, or a grass-type plant, teosinte, that was in Middle America, and it was teeny tiny, weeny teeny. I mean, it was barely worth anything, but through selective breeding of early humans, it finally, got bigger, and the kernels got starchier and sweeter, and it's evolved into the corn that we see these days. And it's a flower, or an imperfect flower. Usually when you think of flowers, it's got the male parts and the female parts all in one, and the male parts are what blow in the wind and make you sneeze, but some of it stick to the sticky parts of the lady parts of the flower, and they go in, and they develop a fruit oftentimes. Whenever you see an apple on an apple tree, it was one time a flower. When it comes to corn, the male parts at the very top are the tassel, a bunch of little inflorescences up at the top that drop a bunch of puffy sperm, basically, onto the ear, which grows halfway up the stalk. Usually a stalk of corn only grows one ear of corn. And you've got the silk, which is that sticky lady part of the plant. So on a corn plant, male parts up here, female parts down here. So although it is monoecious, which is one plant that has both male and female parts, they're separated. So pollen's got to fall down on this. And as the pollen lands on the silk, it's caught up and germinates immediately. Each little pollen grain will germinate immediately. Even if multiple pollen grains land on this, only one of them will mature, travel down the length of the silk and to its corresponding kernel. Each of these are ovum, or ovules? Eggs, basically. Each one of these is a genetic individual because, individual pollen grains fall onto them, and each of these has their own genetic makeup. So you could have 1,000 different genetic individuals coming from this, theoretically. Each piece of corn silk attaches to one piece of corn nibblin. And if they don't get pollinated, they don't turn into corn. Also, they can self-abort if conditions aren't favorable. If you've ever opened up corn that it starts at the tip, and it looks clear that there's starch in there. They tried to grow, but maybe they were water stressed or something else happened, and they had to start getting rid of some of these to save the plant. For the fitness of the plant, they start self-aborting up here. So back to my job. We went out during tasseling season, and we would self-pollinate all of these corn plants, because if we were doing a trial on these 3 rows, you did not want these ears to be fertilized by those tassels over there. We would don these Tyvek suits, these full zip-up white suits, and wear gloves and, have ammonia, things to clean off and sterilize all of our equipment. We had these little bags. So we would take the little paper bag, reach up, put it over the tassel, hold it tight, bend it over. I think we broke it off. And then we shook the bag, and we took the tassel out, and then we took that bag, and we would put the smallish ear of corn, we would put the bag over the ear of corn. I think we just twisted them. It was almost like one of those hot dog sleeves that you get at the gas station when they put the hot dog in, and you can kind of crimp it shut. It's half foil, half paper. We had those kinds of bags. We snapped the tassel off in those, shook the pollen off, and then put them on the corn, and then kind of twisted it shut so that we would know that this individual plant should have been pollinated by itself. But yeah, that's a quick down and dirty anatomy of your corn plant. And there's field corn. They grow bigger and they're starchier, and we feed animals with those and make biofuels with them. And some other beverages. And since it's domestic, it's maintained by humans. I think it's 8 generations, 8 generations of corn plant, replanting itself, setting its own seed before it doesn't look anything like this anymore. And a whole bunch of our fruits and vegetables in the store are like that. Strawberries, peaches, watermelons. If you saw the wild variety of where they came from, wild chickens, there are wild chickens. They don't look anything like the big-breasted deliciousness that we have today. Anyone who hunts wild turkey has an idea of what it means. Corn's also a model organism. One of the chromosomes in corn is so big it's easy to see. We can dye it with fluorescent dye and then see it under microscopy, just like Drosophila. fruit flies. Fruit flies' salivary glands have these enormous chromosomes, and so we were able to like watch them divide. And just like the mitotic division of corn, we use their chromosomes to like physically watch what's going on. They're model organisms. You can also make a tea out of corn silica. It's supposed to be good for your pee-pee system. I think about that job every time I make sweet corn. I think about how one pollen grain grows a little tube, germinates and grows a little tube down to each piece of corn. Hey friend, I don't know if you realize what an involved question you might have asked, or maybe that's just what my brain does to some things. But I'll do the short version, and then I will do a longer info dump for anybody who wants a little bit more in-depth reasoning for it. Also, I'm not a corn farmer, and I haven't really even studied corn farming, but I was heavy into genetics when I was in college. I've got a biology degree, and I was really into molecular genetics, and I thought I would be working in a lab, or at least as a genetic counselor or something. Didn't turn out that way. I own a welding business. But I've got books and books on genetics, and I try to keep up on it because it is like the coolest Sudoku puzzle ever. Having said that, if you are a corn farmer and I am wrong, please don't get mad at me. Just correct me in a video or in a comment or something, and I will do my best to correct myself. The question is, why does corn get detasseled? In my last video, I talked about how corn is an imperfect flower, and the lady parts are down here, and the male parts are up here, and the pollen drops onto the corn ear, and that's how it gets pollinated and turns into corn. So why on earth would farmers want to take the tassels off of the top of their corn plant? If the kernels don't get pollinated, you don't get a nice, robust ear of sweet corn that you can eat, or field corn that your animals can eat. And the answer lies in hybridization. If you are a farmer that is growing corn for seed, you want to carefully control the parent plants and the offspring. You will sometimes see rows of corn with a company name on the end of it because the farmer is growing that corn for seed to sell back to that company. And you can only make a really good seed by crossing a known true line variety of corn with another pure known true line variety of corn to produce the second generation hybrid. So let's just say, hypothetically, there's been a developed for sweetness, and this corn tastes really good, but it doesn't do so well in cold climates. This corn does really well in cold climates, but it doesn't taste quite as sweet. It doesn't have the same sugar content. You might try to cross those two varieties of corn to come up with a super sweet and hearty new line. This is part of how we introduce new traits into an organism. It's selective breeding, and we've been doing it for thousands of years. That's how we got corn from the teosinte plant. Somebody corrected me, thank you. It's one of those words I've only ever read. Teosinte was a real rough grass-like thing with kernels that were only real tiny, and then through years and years of selective breeding, artificial breeding, not natural selection, it was artificial selection selected by humans. Artificial selection is what Darwin was talking about when he was talking about natural selection, except people are doing it. Natural selection is factors like the environment and predation and disease acting on an organism to select for the most fit genes to be passed on to the next generation. Artificial selection or selective breeding is us choosing the desirable traits that we want to be bred into an organism. So companies take an amazing type of corn and another amazing type of corn, and they combine them into these rows. And the only way of doing that is by detasseling. Farmers will plant one variety, one row to be a male, and then plant a few rows of female plants of a different variety, and then a male, and then 3 females. They denote them as male because they're allowed to keep their tassels. And the female ones, they're not really female plants, they just get their tassels whacked off. So when it comes time for pollination, they are taking corn variety A, their tassels, and pollinating the ears of corn variety B, so that all of the seeds in the F1 generation are this hybrid cross that the company wants. The advantage of these crosses is that they have got a much higher genetic diversity, which you can see in humans, right? That's why we don't like inbreeding within families, and that has to do with dominant and recessive traits. Because we've all got faults, but they're often covered up by a stronger version of that gene. We have 2 versions of each gene, one from mom, one from dad. If we've got one copy of the bad gene, it's often suppressed by the healthier, stronger copy of that gene. If we get 2 copies of that faulty gene, that gets expressed, and if it's the type of gene that can make you less fit, it causes some real problems within the individual. So when you are growing corn at home and you get seed A and you plant it in rows and you get delicious sweet corn at the end of the day, you can save those cobs and replant them again, but you are not going to get the genetic diversity of the hybridized seeds. You also aren't going to get the consistency of a hybridized seed. It works very well. We have 2 gene copies each. Each of those genes codes for, say, the same protein. And if a mutation comes in and occurs at one of those alleles, it can kind of be taken over by the other one. And if a mutation occurs at that same locus on the same gene, now you've got a faulty protein. Genes control everything from the way that our muscles are built and our skeletal systems and our nervous systems and our metabolism to our eye color and a lot of our thought processes. They are distinct, concrete instructions for our body to work that can get changed in so many different ways, and we're still learning. We're learning about gene switches and how they can be turned on and off depending on the environment the organism is subjected to. Sometimes you can get one or the other of the genes. Sometimes they blend and you get a mix of both of them. Sometimes a trait is controlled by one gene alone. Sometimes one trait is controlled by several genes. Sometimes you'll see 2 traits tied together on the same gene. Think about how all calico cats are female. It's that tricolor coloration that is attached to the X chromosome, although there are rare instances of male-presenting calico cats. Yes, cats can get Klinefelter syndrome too. That's a super simple example in nature where the presentation of the female has male parts and female genetics. So because of what the cat is on the inside, they present as female except for the external sex organs. It's goofy, right? Why shouldn't matter. Where was I? Corn sex. Offspring of hybrids fairly do very well, so as I understand it, the corn companies aren't too worried about people taking the field corn or the sweet corn that you're getting off the store to eat and replanting it. Like, why would farmers bother to buy sweet corn seed if you can just take the sweet corn out of the supermarket and plant it and grow it? Which you can. But because it's self-pollinated, you're not going to have the genetic diversity as if you have 2 separate individuals coming together for the next generation. Again, for the same reason that we don't date our cousins. It's those same genes that code for the good things like sweetness and drought resistance and wind resistance and disease resistance and pest resistance. When they combine, you might not always get the right combination. You might get 2 weak copies. You might get 2 faulty copies on something very important, and you're not going to get a very strong plant. And that's where generations and generations of people who have selectively bred these lines come in. So farmers detassel the corn plants that they wish to remain female so that they can only take the designated male plants' pollen and pollinate the female plants, one variety with another variety. And then they discard the tassel plants because the tassel plants are really only stud stock. They're not keeping that corn to sell and market. They're keeping the hybridized seed off of the female plant. And if you're a farmer growing sweet corn or field corn for the end user, and I'm actually eating it off the cob and not planting it for a next generation down, you can just self those corn plants. That's what we do in our home gardens. You get a hybrid corn variety and you plant it and you grow it and you eat it and it's delicious. That's why I mentioned in that last video that without human intervention and tending, a corn plant goes back to its wild variety within like 8 generations. Somebody should check me on that. It's the same way with dogs, if I remember. I remember reading a study about dogs. We've selectively bred one individual. It's not the gray wolf. They found it's a different species, but all dogs are the same species. They can interbreed, sometimes better than others. If all humans were wiped off the face of the planet and all the animals were left to their own devices, some dogs would die off like immediately because they are not suited to their own environment or to like any environment without human help. The present day dogs best suited to dealing with the world, with nature, are the mutts, are the ones that have like the highest genetic diversity. Theoretically, without any human intervention, the dogs that would exist 50 years from then would all be the same like wild type dog adapted to whatever climate the populations were reproducing in. Generally pretty much reverting back to the old line of like wolf dog that they came from. Just like unattended corn plants would revert back to a wild grass type thing. So I hope that helped, and I hope I was right, and I hope that it was entertaining. I invite people who know better than me to put where I was wrong in the comments or where I was right so that people can peer review these things. Also, look at my shirt. I love it so much. This is Gregor Mendel. He's the father of modern genetics. He's the one that had sweet pea plants. He saw a variation in the colors of the flowers, and he painstakingly cross-pollinated and kept very good records of the colors that showed up. Everything he determined was so basic that children can do it in school now, but it was this radical idea when it first came up, and no one wanted to accept it. That's an important thing to note, is all of these radical new ideas of heritable traits, even something as simple as the things that farmers had been doing for thousands of years, weren't accepted because someone decided to write it down and call it scientific. That was my info dump for the day.